Good evening. What a spectacular place we are in tonight. And as soon as I arrived here, I thought, hang on, am I wearing the right clothes? Because I'm going to be talking about covering financial crises. And I thought, hang on, Mission Impossible. The costume of the Bourne Identity. And then I thought, no, a knight's tale, a bit of armor for going into battle. But the gangs of New York for all the Wall Street shenanigans, although I think that probably wouldn't match my hair. But then I thought, if I was really going to change costumes, which I'm not, this. Fred the Shred. Royal Bank of Scotland from the movie Highlander. That would be the outfit to wear. I'm going to talk this evening from here. If it disturbs anybody because you can't see me and you wish to see me, which is not necessarily the same thing, then I can go up there. But I thought I would be a little bit more informal down here. Let me start by saying it is a truly daunting task being invited by one's former university to give a lecture. When the invitation arrives, my mind immediately was cast back to those long hours 3 decades ago in the Roger Stevens lecture hall. Watching professors wrestle with transparencies and overhead projectors. PowerPoints were a thing yet to be invented. And suddenly I was racked with worry. Think about it. How on earth was I going to give a lecture? Me, my public speaking, as you now have witnessed quite clearly, is limited to bursts of 2 or 3 minutes and is never challenged academically. So any of you expecting a rigorous academic lecture on the financial crisis, you're going to be seriously disappointed. What I will offer you instead tonight is a look at the financial crises of the past 25 years through the eyes and experience of someone who has covered them and who today is still at the coal face with the nightly programme Quest Means Business. I hope to give you an idea why these crises are so hard to discover, fiendishly difficult to actually cover, and why we do such a bad job with it generally. It was 1987 and I was just out of Leeds and I was in my news training at the BBC. The small screen, the little green computer, who remembers those little green computers, you know, long before Windows. Anyway, it was our link to Wall Street and the numbers on it were behaving very oddly. The numbers were flashing that we'd never seen before. The Dow Jones, which usually moved in single digits, was now moving in double and triple digits, and it was going down. The market was collapsing. This was Black Monday when the Dow dropped a staggering 22.5%, which still, incidentally, ranks as the single largest percentage fall in the US market. For me, every other financial crisis over the next 25 years has to be seen through the prism of covering those desperate days back in October of 1987, when we really didn't know whether financial Armageddon was on top of us. I was dispatched to Wall Street, where I heard the then CEO of the New York Stock Exchange, John Phelan. He said famously that this was the nearest thing he'd ever seen to a meltdown. And his exact words were, it's the nearest thing to a meltdown I ever want to see. Here's the funny thing. It would be 20 years till I heard that phrase again, and this time from the then Chancellor of the Exchequer, Alistair Darling, talking about on 6th of October 2008, when it seemed that Britain's banks were going to go bust. During the coverage of the '87 crash, I learnt my first serious lesson, rushing round like a blue-arse fly trying to cover it left, right and centre. The then financial editor stopped me, Vincent Duggleby, he stopped me and he said, take it easy. These crises last for weeks, if not months. This will be going for a long time. It was an advice I was able to pass on to the younger generation in the 2007. A financial crisis is invariably a long haul. Forget what we may tell you on the television. It is a long haul. It is never a short sprint. In '87, the blame for the crash was put firmly on computer trading. And yet this was the first financial crisis where computers got the blame, not those who had programmed them. We were to see this again in May of 2010 with the so-called flash crash, when the Dow Jones fell nearly 1,000 points in less than 10 minutes. This time, it was high-frequency computer trading that was blamed. Now, I was on air at the time. A bowel-churning experience. Because the beauty of 24-hour news is crises happen in real time. And you have to cover them. And frankly, you've got no idea what is happening. You are literally making it up as you go along. You're hopingly drawing on a reservoir of experience and some knowledge. We watched the Dow fall, and we just did not know if this was going to continue falling. Of course, it didn't. It turned around and went back up again. What it tells you, though, is that it's a bit like covering a war, where you have hours of tedium followed by moments of intense action. And it's the same with covering markets and covering finance. The market moves, like in the flash crash, and nothing happens after that. It's all quiet. And you have nothing to do for the next 3 weeks. The ERM crisis in this country in 1992 is another example. It happened, the markets fell, and then we had to pontificate for the next 6 months. The next real transatlantic crisis was the dot-com boom and bust of the 1990s. On both sides of the Atlantic, the market was roaring because of this new thing. It was called the Internet. Bill Clinton and Al Gore had described it as the information superhighway. The only problem with this superhighway was investors and journalists didn't know the rules of this new road. Companies which had absolutely no revenues, certainly no profits, were advertising like mad, coined a new phrase, the path to profitability. Every time I interviewed a chief exec of a firm like Pet.com or some other an equally unappetizing company, they would always say on their results, nah, we're not making money yet, but we're on the path to profitability. And here is the point. As a journalist who had been trained and steeped in traditional business journalism, it's hard to pin these people down. They treated me as someone who had failed to see the Messiah of the future. I was not one of the enlightened. They rolled their eyes, and acid dripped from their tongues as they suggested I was a Luddite. And I was partly powerless to respond because the market was giving its own verdict. Between 1990 and the year 2000, the Dow Jones rose 389%, and everyone was entranced by what was taking place. So, you might ask, well, come on, Quest. You're supposed to be a journalist, bit of skepticism, bit of cynicism. Well, you had people like the chairman of the Fed, Alan Greenspan, who did question the sustainability of it. He used the phrase irrational exuberance. But think about it. Who in their right minds is honestly going to say, this is a disaster, the sky is going to fall in? Because even Greenspan was preaching that the internet had created a new paradigm of productivity. He said it had rewritten the economic rules. Unfortunately, he was wrong. Irrational exuberance won out, and the Nasdaq collapsed 4,000 points, more than 77% from peak to trough. Now, here's a little tell. I actually bought stocks, legitimately. There was no Daily Mirrors about them. And every one of those stocks in the internet companies I bought at the peak. I mean, that just shows how dreadful an investor I am. You know, when people always say to me, you know, what should they do with their money? I say, do you really think I'd be doing this if I could make money doing that? Anyway, most of the companies I bought in have gone out of business. Some, like Cisco, I paid $77 a share. It's trading at about 18 now. I turned a portfolio that cost me $60,000 into one that's worth about $16,000 today. But here's the point. I have never sold one share. I have never got rid of them. I keep them as a reminder of hubris, which I'm very wary of and aware of as we look at this next thing, which I will talk about later, social media. So we need to turn our attention now to the Great Recession of 2007. We can sum it up really simply. A US housing crisis turns into a global banking calamity, which spawns a European sovereign debt disaster and is still threatening us today. And it sounds so simple when I say it like that, but think of it this way. How could home mortgages in California and Florida eventually lead to the nationalizing of banks in Britain, a bankruptcy in Greece, and the near collapse of the euro? It's not part of my task today to describe the crisis and how it happened. But it is part of my job to answer the question from a journalist's point of view. The question was asked by the Queen in 2009 on a visit to the London School of Economics, when Her Majesty said, "Why did no one see it coming?" And I answer it tonight with the experience of Black Monday, dot-com boom and bust, computer trading, and all the evidence of stories that we had covered, or I'd covered. And I answer it with humility, because I didn't see the Great Recession coming. Oh yes, there were people like Nouriel Roubini of New York, nicknamed Dr. Doom. He was forecasting the worst, and worse still, and he's still forecasting it. But most of us thought he was a crank. And why? Because even in 2007, after 15 years of growth, the most we really thought was going to happen was a cyclical slowdown and possibly a minor recession. Why? Because there was no evidence to support anything else. It was against everything we were seeing in the market. This brings me to the fundamental points. Financial crises are just about impossible to predict accurately. The origins of the Great Recession is in hundreds, if not thousands, of annual bank lending statistics. Foreclosure numbers, Tier 1 capital ratios, credit rating reports, which we now know were a work of fiction. The problems were structural, such as the UK's tripartite agreement for regulation. It is the very nature of a financial crisis that it is what the US Senate called in its report, which took them 2 years to write, by the way. They didn't exactly do it speedily. It took them 2 years to decide that there was the cogs of the wheels of financial destruction, and they are deep in the heart of the market. It takes weeks, if not months, of detailed research to spot the weaknesses. So, some of you will be thinking, yeah, but that's your job, Quest. That's what we pay your money for. That's why we watch you on television. You're not pretty good if you can't spot that. All right, think of it this way. Think of a cooking stove with thousands of pots on it. Thousands upon thousands of pots on one cooking stove. And you have to work out which one is about to boil over when all of them are bubbling. And most of them are bubbling respectably. And you have to pinpoint which are the dangerous ones within that. Because economic crises do not happen overnight. And reporting the imbalances in a global economy is as dull as ditch water. I'll give you an example. This week, I have received a brokerage report, or an analyst report as we call them now. It talks about how transfers between Eurozone central banks through the payment system Target 2 are now showing worrying imbalances. Anybody want to watch a report on that? Because this is my second fundamental point. We couldn't have got the stories on air even if we'd wanted to. If these financial stories are hard to tell, they are just about impossible to sell in the newsroom. Never mind to you, and I'll get to you lot later. Before 2007, there was, and I think still is, an inherent animosity in most newsrooms to financial stories. Lord Burt, in the 1980s, described his theory of journalism as the bias against understanding. His lordship, he said basically, pictures are allowed to dictate the story, and journalists have no mission to explain. Well, when I worked for Burt, as one of his journos, I would never have criticised his theory or dreamt to have criticised the Oracle. Today, with 25 years behind me, I'm less deferential. I redefine Burtism as a bias against financial journalism. The mere sight and sound of a number, an index, sends editors running for the hills. And yet, senior editors and producers love strategic stories and adore geopolitical machinations, preferably involving a dictatorship and nuclear weapons. My diplomatic and foreign affairs colleagues get time galore for stories on obscure, tribal conflicts, which frankly threaten almost nothing, let alone the financial well-being of the developed world. There's a perceived gravitas in having someone from the Royal Institute of Worthy Studies on the programme to speculate to their heart's content, but I promise you, when I put a decent analyst on the air to talk about something like might be happening on credit derivatives, we're accused of jargon. Remember, it was Nigel Lawson that talked about teenage scribblers. 3 months ago, I had a blazing row with a colleague who kept glibly saying she didn't understand all that financial stuff and bailouts. But she thought nothing of immersing herself in the minutiae of the Afghan lawyer Jirga tribunals. My curt point to my colleague was to watch my programme and learn. The corollary to this financial incipience by many of my colleagues is that we don't get the time to delve into crises. 5 years ago, if I said I need to do a piece on the US housing market, which we know is overheating, and we hear that the German Landesbanks have got some pretty dodgy investments, you can imagine. Any more than the analyst who tried to warn the SEC twice about Bernie Madoff was listened to. And even today, I can tell in broadcast newsrooms in the US and in the UK, producers would rather grapple with this story, the economy, with a political twist. Focus on a coalition split. Look at how it deals with the politics of it, rather than truly get to grips with what a downgrade of a AAA means. And God forbid you throw in a number. Now, of course, this does not mean we don't try. We, of course, try to expose the weaknesses in the system and the way the companies and economies are being run. It's just very difficult to wheedle out this information and then get it on air. And it has to be done in the face of growing economies, rising markets, increasing wealth. And this is where you come in. You don't want to hear that this party isn't going to last, especially if you are trying to get an invitation to it and you feel that you're a Johnny-come-lately. Our competitor network, CNBC, discovered this in .com. In the good days when the Nasdaq was rising, Everyone was watching CNBC and watching themselves get richer. When things turned sour and the Nasdaq collapsed, their viewers evaporated. It seems people don't like to see themselves getting poorer quite as much. And then here's the final fundamental rule. Even if I have all the evidence and I've managed to get the airtime, and you're going to watch, we are met with a barrage of denial and abuse which calls into question the journalism and our credibility. And for that, I do not need to go back 20 years. I go back 20 months. As the European debt crisis brewed, time and again, we said Greece would need a bailout. Now, normally, we hedge ourselves. We use what Wikipedia calls weasel words. Sources say, it's widely believed, it's generally understood. But this time, responding to my failures in 2007 and 8, no mincing of words. Greece will need a bailout, and other countries will follow. And yet the Greek Prime Minister, on at least 3 occasions in interviews with me, denied even the possibility of it, as did President Barroso of the Commission and President Trichet of the ECB. Now, of course, I hear you say they're going to put a brave face on a really dreadful situation. But see it from both sides. They were denying bailouts right up until the moment they were writing the checks. And the same with Greece defaulting. They denied it right up until the day it happened. It's infuriating. Particularly when these same people will say privately to you what they won't say publicly, and then whisper, "Of course, old chap, I can't say that officially." I mentioned how difficult it is to swim against the tide of the trend, but I promise you, I feel I'm witnessing it all over again with something known as social media. 2 weeks ago, Facebook announced it was paying, or would pay, $1 billion for Instagram, a company with few revenues and fewer profits. Let us just pause for one moment. Anybody in here who regularly or uses Instagram, just raise your hand. Oh, we've got 1. 2. Come on, Instagrammers. Fine. All right. I have been trying for weeks to get somebody to explain to me why Instagram is worth $1 billion of Facebook paper. Because even if it does have value, is it worth $1 billion? Out they come from the woodwork. The old .com soothsayers redux. This time, they're calling themselves social media experts or consultants, and they're suggesting that for me, as somebody as age 50, I can't be expected to understand. I feel like I'm watching history all over again. When Facebook launches itself on the market, as it will do with its IPO, will it really be worthy as one of the most valuable companies in the world? How many people use Facebook in here? Yeah, you see, that's better. There's 900 million Facebookers around the world. But by every traditional barometer, this company's not worth that amount of money. A bubble is starting to build up again. And as surely as it is happening, as journalists covering the story, I have decided to be much more skeptical, and I'm already feeling the backlash. I do not defend the fact I missed the financial crisis. I wish I was one of those people of whom it's now said, Quest saw it coming. But this was the first crisis of the true global era, where rotten market foundations festered in one part of the world were able to infect another across an ocean. What I defend is the way we cover these crises. After Lehman and Britain's banking crisis, I was constantly asked, are we going into a recession? To me and anyone who's covered markets since the 80s, the answer was obvious. You can't have that level of dislocation without a recession. Guess what? The politicians denied it, didn't they? In fact, they continued denying it until the fat lady was singing. And in fact, they continued to deny a double dip in Britain until the numbers came out yesterday and were described as very disappointing. So we have to use different and imaginative ways to cover these crises. You saw, for example, one of them there. Take quantitative easing. It was interesting, quite funny to see how all the different networks described quantitative easing on the day when the Bank of England did it. One poured oil into a car engine and said that showed money lubricating the economy. Another showed a racetrack. We went for, and you saw it in that video, I went for building the 5-tier champagne tree, and then we poured the water through it. Ladies and gentlemen, what I learned in 1987, and I've seen numerous times since, is that witnessing a market in full flight can be a terrifying ordeal. Markets are living, moving organisms because they are the product of the people who take decisions, even in a case where it is a computer or the actions of machines. It is still humans, ultimately, who are involved. And behind the movements of the screen, behind those movements are people like you and me. It may be a traveling salesman who's worried about how the company will survive a growing recession. It's almost certainly a pensioner who's now concerned that their capital will last through their lifetime. And usually there's also the disadvantaged who know that their lifeline benefits will be the victim of austerity cuts. In an ideal world, we would do a much better job of covering financial crises before they happen. But for the reasons I've given, that is simply neither realistic nor possible. The stories are beyond the resources of most journalists and most organizations. The editors won't run them because of a bias against complex financial stories, and you won't watch them because you're too busy trying to work out how you can make money out of what is no doubt a bubble that is about to burst. So I am left on Quest Means Business with my simple mission each night. I promise you only two things. I will give you the facts. I will give you the best analysis there is in the world. And then it is up to you. Just please don't blame me afterwards. I shall be more than happy to take questions.